Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters. Today we are joined by a historian who specialises on the cultural, social history of Britain during the Second World War. His books include Britain at Bay, a history of Britain at the start of the Second World War up until 1941, and Browned Off and Bloody Minded, a social history of the British Army in the Second World War. A fellow Liverpool fan who no doubt is still recovering, as I am, from Jurgen Klopp's goodbyes at Anfield at the weekend. I am delighted to be joined by Alan Allport, the Dr. Walter Montgomery and Marion Gruber Professor of History at Syracuse University, New York, who is joining us today. Alan, welcome.
Hello. Very nice
Hi, Alan.
to be
It's great to have you here. Can I just say it and get my fangirling out the way first of all? I absolutely love Britain at Bay. It's one of my favourite.
Oh, it's brilliant.
About the Second World War. Yeah, I just love it. Yeah, right. That's the fangirl bit over. Right.
No. Feel free.
So, what are you working on at the moment? Then you've got another book that you're working on. Is that
So
right?
I have a sequel.
Oh,
Yeah. The sequel to Britain at Bay is provisionally called Advanced Britannia. It could possibly change between now and now. But I'm brilliant. That's my title of preference. That should be out in September 2025. So in about a year and a bit. So I am working on finishing a manuscript for that. And it's fascinating because there's lots of stuff about the bombing war, amongst other things, that I've never actually written about before. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And does that take sort of right up to the end of the war as well?
Yeah, that finishes the war. And then there is a bit of a reflection upon, sort of where Britain ends up at the end of the war, and try to ruminate a little bit about what it all meant in the end.
Great. That sounds fantastic. Right, shall we get on with our questions then? Get stuck in straight away. Right, so in our last couple of episodes, we focused on the bombing of the Ruhr Valley. Now, in Britain at Bay, Alan, you say that the decision of the British cabinet to allow the RAF to start bombing the Ruhr on the 15th of May 1940 was a watershed moment in the history of the Second World War. I just wondered, could you sort of expand on that and go into a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think what's interesting about the decision in mid-May 1940, it's really the only occasion during the whole war when the war cabinet actually makes a fundamental decision about whether to bomb German cities or not. They had been mulling over this issue ever since before the war, but in the first 8 months of the war, during the Phoney War. And it had been a big topic of conversation at the Supreme War Council with the French. And up to this point, I mean, the RAF had been pushing for this. This had always been one of what were called their Western Air plans. But the French had always vetoed it on the grounds that they were worried about reprisal raids, retaliation against French cities. And so the issue had kind of been moot during the Phoney War. But of course, it comes to a new urgency when the Germans invade France and the Low Countries on 10th of May 1940. And so what's interesting, if you look at the War Cabinet minutes, is how much of the discussion in the War Cabinet for those 5 days is just about bombing. It's actually, they talk surprisingly little about the actual ground campaign, which says something about how much they thought, how decisive they thought it was going to be, and how quickly. So eventually they do decide, they give permission for the RAF to bomb the Ruhr on the night of 15th, 16th of May. They talk a lot about possible retaliation, about possible reprisals. They talk a lot about the effect it's going to have on neutral opinion, particularly in the United States. But the thing that's curious is that they completely take for granted the idea that it is going to be decisive. It will have an enormous effect, and it will have an immediate effect. That's sort of just taken as a given. Now, of course, it's going to be neither decisive in an immediate sense or have any impact at all on the ground campaign. The hope is that by bombing the Ruhr, they may be able to paralyze the German economy and so stop the attack on France. That clearly doesn't happen. And by June 22nd, of course, the campaign in France is going to be over relatively quickly. But the bombing goes on. And there's never a moment where the War Cabinet ever really, not just reconsiders the issue, but never really talks about the issue again. Bombing is just sort of taken for granted from that point onwards. It trails off a bit during the summer of 1940, obviously, because Bomber Command is retasked with anti-invasion measures. But even then, there are still occasional raids on the Ruhr. And then in the winter of 1940, it starts to pick up again because of the immediate threat of Operation Sea Lion has gone. They never reconsider it. And it is curious to consider whether, had they known in May 1940 what it was exactly that they were starting, whether they would have taken a decision, almost it seemed in a rather casual way, to begin this. I mean, the bombing war is going to become such a massive investment on the British part. I mean, in material terms, and you could also argue in moral terms as well. It's going to be a peculiarly British way of conducting the war. And yet the actual decision to start it is made in almost such a matter-of-fact way so early and never really revisited.
And it's something, obviously, the targeting of the Ruhr Valley is something which continues more or less from that moment onwards, right up until the end of the war, isn't it? It just doesn't stop.
Yeah. I mean, the final raids on Essen, I think. I mean, I think Essen for the size of the city is the most bombed city in Germany.
There can't have been anything left by spring forward.
No, there isn't. Surely. I mean, the final raid on Essen, I think, takes place about 48 hours before it's occupied by the Americans, and at that point they're just kind of just bombing the rubble. Really, there's nothing.
So it's fair to say that the expectations of the strategic bombing campaign failed to live up to reality, considering the pre-war theory and such like. Can you talk a little about the Butt Report and its impact on Bomber Command?
Yes, the Butt Report. So technically, of course, it should be the Ben-Susan Butt Report. Because it's named after David Ben-Susan Butt. However, the Butt Report is far too funny a name not to use. So, of course, everybody uses that. David Ben-Susan Butt, he is a civil servant who has been seconded as the private secretary to Frederick Lindemann, who later Lord Cherwell, who is the Churchill's sort of pet scientist and scientific advisor throughout the war. The thing about the Butt Report, I mean, it's authored in the summer of 1941. In some ways, it's a response. It wouldn't have been possible to write the Butt Report prior to that because it's a response to the fact that Bomber Command is actually using photographic analysis for the first time of its raid. One of the things about the bombing raids in the first year after May 1940 is that they actually have very little idea what effect it's having because there is almost no direct evidence. So they have to rely upon reports from the pilots and the aircrew, which are often very unreliable. They have to rely on neutral opinion, kind of, businessmen and people like that who are sort of passing through. And it's all very anecdotal and impressionistic. But in the summer of 1941, they have actually begun taking photographs during operations. And so Ben-Susan Butt is tasked with taking a whole bunch of these pictures, like these photographs that have been taken, and trying to do some kind of operational statistical analysis on them. And the conclusion he comes to, notoriously, is that only 1/3 of the bombers claiming to reach their targets are actually reaching them. And by reaching them, he means that they are dropping their bombs within 5 miles of the designated target site. And that 1 in 3 figure is overall, incidentally. When it comes to the Ruhr specifically, he says that it's 1 in 10. So the figures are even worse in certain situations. So I think the Butt Report is interesting in that it tends to be, it's always mentioned now in the kind of histories of Bomber Command. And I think arguably a bit too much emphasis has been placed upon it as the kind of crucial causal moments. The argument tends to be, well, there's the Butt report, and then as a result of this, it's a direct result of this, there's a switch to area bombing. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because for one thing, area bombing has already begun by the time that the Butt report is made. So the first deliberate nighttime area bombing raid on Germany is all the way back in December 1940 when the RAF tried to bomb Mannheim as a retaliation for the bombing of Coventry the month before. The only reason that Mannheim doesn't figure, I think, in the historiography of the bombing war is because unlike the bombing of Coventry, it's completely ineffective. It's total failure. But the intention is clearly there to do a Coventry on a German city. And by the time that you get to the summer of 1941, so a month before the Butt report is published, there's already been an Air Ministry directive from the Chief of the Air Staff saying that from now on, 3/4 of all raids should be directed at urban areas in Germany, and the target should be the morale of the industrial working force in Germany. So in theory, if not in practice, area bombing, as we come to understand it, has already begun by this point, or is certainly in the process of evolving. What I think the significance of the Butt report is it certainly has some political significance. I think it ushers along the process of area bombing to some extent. The Air Ministry's response to it is actually quite interesting because on the one hand, they completely reject it and say this is obviously rubbish. They attack its methodology. And to be fair, that they have a few good points about that some of the statistics are, it's debatable about how reliable they are. But on the other hand, they also, they switch it around and they also say, well, look, this shows that we need more support. This shows that we need more assistance. So one of the things it does is that it increases the pressure for advanced electronic navigational aids. If we can't find our targets, we need the gizmos to be able to find them. So it has a lot to do with the development of G, the first significant electronic navigational aid, which will come into service in 1942. And it's also used as ammunition by Sir Charles Portal to argue for a 4,000 heavy bomber force, which is he has this exchange with Churchill in September 1941, so about a month after the Butt report, arguing that, of course, we're not having the effect that we should because we don't have enough planes. We don't have the right type of planes. If you give us 4,000 heavy bombers, then we can win the war. I think the Butt report is probably further for Churchill. It sort of pushes him further down a kind of skepticism about bombing, which has been growing really ever since the beginning of 1941. Churchill's, this is could be a conversation for a whole show in itself, his attitude toward bombing. He never disavows it. He always thinks for political reasons, if nothing else, then it's a necessary thing to continue. I don't think by the second half of 1941 that he believes that bombing by itself will win the war any longer. I think any sort of hopes that he might have had for that have gone, and the Butt report is certainly sort of further evidence of that. But it also pushes the political decision to uncompromisingly adopt area bombing in February 1942, when there's the famous area bombing directive, which says that all further operations should be tasked towards destroying the morale of the industrial workforce in Germany without exception. And of course, Lindemann is going to come back into the story then, because he will have that famous dehousing paper in April 1942, where he argues that the evidence from the Blitz shows that area bombing is going to be the most effective way of being able to attack Germany. But the decisions by the Air Ministry precede this. These are mostly political documents meant to justify after the fact what the Air Ministry has basically already decided to do.
So you have the famous or infamous area bombing directive then in early 42. And just after that, we have the arrival of Arthur Harris taking over at Bomber Command. Why was Harris seen as the man to take over charge of Bomber Command at that particular time, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Bomber Command has 4 commanders during the war, of which Harris, of course, is the longest serving and also by far the most famous. They begin the war with Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, who probably deserves a program of his own. Actually, it's quite an interesting fellow. He loses the job in 1940 because he has put too much emphasis on creating OTUs, operational training units, rather than the frontline force to attack Germany, which was probably the right decision in hindsight. But he had always got there's always that delicate balance that Bomber Command leaders have to face between preserving and developing the force as a whole, and also actually delivering some immediate goods, for kind of military effect and political effect. And Ludlow Hewitt, is far too focused on the long-term strength of Bomber Command to be politically viable. So they get rid of him, and Sir Charles Portal takes over throughout. For several months in 1940. Portal, though, is obviously destined for greater things. And when Cyril Newell steps down as Chief of the Air Staff, Portal then is promoted to the CAS. So he's going to be the professional head of the RAF for the rest of the war. And then you have Sir Richard Pearce, who is head of Bomber Command up until February 1942. Pearce, Napoleon said that all great commanders need luck, amongst other things. Pearce, I think, is very unlucky. He takes over at a point at which, Bomber Command is at something of its nadir. He also makes some decisions which I think are disastrously judged in the end. There is a notorious raid which he orders on November 7th, 1941. This is at the end of 1941, against Berlin, as an attempt to try and do a showpiece raid. It's the single largest effort that Bomber Command's ever mounted against Germany. The meteorologist warned him that the weather is going to be bad that night. There's going to be frozen storms and hail across Northern Europe. He ignores the orders, and the raid is a total disaster. Only 73 of the 169 bombers actually reach Berlin. About 21 aircraft fail to return to base, probably because they have to ditch in the North Sea because they get caught up in these winter squalls. Another 16 bombers are shot down. 11 Germans are killed in the raid. And the loss rate is such that this is completely unsustainable. So Pearce gets invited, in scare quotes, to go and see Churchill the following day, and it's made pretty clear that the bombing effort will be paused for the time being, and Pearce's days are going to be numbered. So he's totally lost the confidence of the Air Ministry, as well as Churchill himself by that point. So when it comes to January 1942, the decision is that they need someone new. So, of course, we have Sir Arthur Travers Harris. A quick note here. It's like nobody actually called him Bomber Harris, at least to his face. Do you guys know what his nickname was?
Is it Bert?
Butch.
No, Butch.
Bert, yeah. People called him
Bert.
Yeah.
Bert, yeah. Some people called him Ginger, apparently, because of his auburn locks.
That was brave of them. Yeah.
It was very brave of him, yeah. He sort of tolerated Bomber, which was something that had been dreamed up by the press, but he didn't particularly like it. And of course, the crews called him Butch or Butch.
Yeah.
So he is, I think to some degree, he is appointed because he's obviously the next man in line. He had been the commander of 5 Group earlier on in the war. He's been the deputy chief of the air staff. He's been before the war, he had been in the Joint Planning Staff. And he's actually in Washington, D.C. when he's appointed to head of Bomber Command. He is part of the RAF liaison to the United States, and they're trying to hurry up the process of sending Lend-Lease aircraft to the UK. So I think it's partly because of his seniority. I think it's also partly because of his qualities and his known temperament. I mean, Harris is known as an extremely hardworking man. He is his organizational skills are methodical and widely admired. I also think he has a kind of indefatigable personality, which contrasts very much with Pierce, and I think he's sort of seen as being somebody who, a good man to take a good firm grip on the rudder at this particular juncture. There's a little anecdote which I always love about Harris, which is that when he gets to High Wycombe in February 1942, he's come back from the States, and he has an official residence just near the RAF base there. And Lady Pierce is still living there, so the wife of Sir Richard Pierce. And apparently Lady Pierce has requested and been granted by the Air Ministry special dispensation to stay in the house for another couple of months because of her ill health. So Harris arrives in High Wycombe. He goes round to see Lady Pierce. He takes one look at her and decides there's absolutely nothing wrong with her, and informs the Air Ministry that she needs to leave. And so poor Lady Pierce is booted out after a couple of days. So I think he starts as he means to go on. And that's Harris thereafter.
Mm-hmm. So this is a pretty big question. Did Harris deliver what was expected of him by Churchill, the War Cabinet, and the British people?
Well, Harris doesn't make strategic or operational policy. I think that's an important thing to emphasize from the very beginning. There is this sort of sense that Harris arrives and decides to area bomb, and that continues. Well, I mean, for one thing, of course, the chronology is all wrong with that, because this process had begun long before Harris arrived. Well, and in fact, the famous area bombing directive, as I think you just mentioned a moment ago, actually is sent a week before he's actually appointed. But it also misunderstands the hierarchy, because Harris doesn't have the authority to make strategic or operational policy. He doesn't decide what the basic target systems will be. He doesn't decide what the rules of engagement will be. At any point, that could be overruled from either from Ad Astral House or from Whitehall. Air Ministry and the War Cabinet that make these decisions. And from December 1941, it's also, of course, the Combined Chiefs of Staff, so the Americans. Harris obviously does have some leeway in the particular choice of targets that he has. So he has some tactical decision-making to make. He has a reputation of breaking the rules or not following his orders, which I actually think is rather unfair. Harris is certainly blunt-spoken to the point of being downright insolent at times, and some of the correspondence that he has with Portal is not particularly temperate. That said, however, I don't think there's ever a single occasion you can point to during the war when Harris deliberately, knowingly disobeys his instructions. What he does do is that he looks for loopholes.
Yeah, it's interpretation, isn't it? How he interprets those.
Yes,
absolutely.
A lot of it is about interpretation. And also, he's also quite clever in that he takes a role in the drafting of some of the decisions and deliberately shapes it often to be somewhat ambivalent or vague or even contradictory, which allows him more scope to do the kind of raids that he would like. So probably the most famous example of this is the Point Blank Directive in the summer of 1943. Now, if you read the Point Blank Directive, it actually makes no sense at all. Because it basically it says there is one overriding priority, which is to attack the German Air Force and aero industry, but there's also another overriding priority, which is to attack the industrial.
Here's a big long list of other things that we also need to attack.
Well, which overriding priority comes before the other overriding priority? Now, Harris played a role in the drafting of the Point Blank Memorandum, and it's quite clear that he deliberately introduced ambiguity there because that would allow him to do what he wanted. But that's not the same thing as breaking the rules. That's simply shaping the rules to fit your own desire. Later on in the war, there's the famous exchange between him and Portal between October 1944 and January 1945 about oil policy. And Harris is often accused then of breaking the rules. But I think Seb Cox in particular has done a good job of arguing that actually Harris is not breaking the rules. Harris is simply interpreting the rules in a perfectly reasonable way about what he can and can't attack on any given night, given the kind of the weather conditions and other things like that. So Harris is, part of when we ask, did Harris deliver the goods? Harris did what he was told. I mean, Harris followed the basic instructions that he'd been given by his military and his political superiors. Now, what I think is unquestionably true is that Harris believes in area bombing in a way that many of his superiors do not. Portal being, of course, I think the best example of Portal, who clearly by the beginning of 1944, whatever enthusiasm he had originally had for area bombing has largely dissipated, and he has now changed his mind. Harris, of course, never changes his mind, and will not change his mind after the war either. We'll maybe talk a little bit about his kind of post-war reflections on that too. Churchill goes totally back and forth on this, and is, I think, both inconsistent and also, I think, frankly, quite cowardly in the way that he deals with his responsibility for area bombing after the war. But at the end of the day, Harris area bombed because he was told to. And if he had not done it in 1942, he would have been sacked and somebody else would have taken his place. Yeah. So the only thing I guess that he can be accused of is having taken his instructions very seriously and believed in them a great deal in a way perhaps that other people did not.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair assessment. Absolutely. Yeah,
definitely.
So still talking about Harris then, to what degree do you think Harris is tied into the collective memory and post-war historiography of Bomber Command? In so many sort of accounts and in sort of popular memory, it seems to be all about him. But it shouldn't be, in my view. Can you sort of give us your views on that a bit, Alan?
Well, I mean, he's such a larger-than-life figure, isn't he? I mean, that's part of the thing, and who can't latch onto a name like Bomber Harris? And Harris is great, depending on how you look at it, as either his great virtue or his great failing was his absolute refusal to be mealy-mouthed about what he was doing. He has several exchanges with the Air Ministry about this during the war, where he says, we are deliberately targeting German civilians, and we need to stop being euphemistic about this. We need to stop being sort of talking around this in sort of polite paraphrases and actually be honest. Mainly from Harris's point of view, because he's worried about the morale of his crews. He thinks that his men are perfectly well aware of what's going on. And if they constantly in statements in the House of Commons or in newspapers that, of course, the British are not deliberately targeting civilians, then they will get the impression that they are doing something wrong, that they are doing something shameful, which, from Harris's point of view, they're not. They're just completely following their orders and actually, doing the thing that's most necessary to win the war. So he doesn't win himself any friends, I think, in that way. And I think part of the problem, of course, is that Harris makes a lot of enemies, and that is to some extent reflected then in his position in the post-war historiography. So when it comes to assessing the bombing war after VE Day, Harris gets the chance to write a dispatch, as most of the senior commanders do, but it's not published. And in fact, there is a very heavily annotated version of it, which is kept by the Air Ministry, which includes lots of comments to the effect of, we don't agree with him about this. Because Harris still uncompromisingly believes in area bombing in 1955. Whereas, of course, the sort of the mood of the the RAF and it has changed. That you've got the influence of people like Portal and Tedder, and there are scientific advisors like Solly Zuckerman who have now switched to the idea that actually either transportation or oil bombing had been the most effective thing. That's heavily reflected in the British Bombing Survey Unit report in shortly after the war, which doesn't have any major input from Harris.
It's very patchy. It's also, of course, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
Well, it's very patchy because it's done because the British have got no money, so it's all done on a shoestring. You've got the absolutely massive US strategic survey, which is slightly contradictory, actually. The US strategic survey would be worth another program in itself. I think it's, if you actually ever look at it, it's this massive collection of documents, and some of them flatly contradict each other in terms of what the authors conclude. But broadly speaking, certainly the general report by the US Strategic Survey, which had been written by John Kenneth Galbraith, is pretty dismissive of area bombing. And that, I think, has sort of become the official RAF line by the late 40s, which is that it was misapplied, at least until the very last minute. Harris never believes that, but he's not. I mean, in some ways you can have some sympathy for him, because I don't think he's ever quite allowed to argue his case, because he's told to basically, he's not allowed to reveal a lot of information in the late 40s for security reasons. So he writes his memoir, Bomber Offensive, but he's not allowed to include a great deal of statistical information in that for security reasons. On the other hand, I also think Harris, of course, is an absolute maximalist when it comes to air power. I mean, his argument is in Bomber Offensive that there was no reason on the face of it why the campaign in 1944 couldn't have been fought in 1943. That they couldn't, there was no reason why the RAF couldn't have had the same number of heavies in 1943 as it was eventually going to have in 1944. The only reason from his point of view is inefficiency and a lack of will and too much misdirection of effort. And Harris argues that had they had the 1944 bomber force in 1943, they could have bombed Germany to a standstill and overload would have been unnecessary. Now, I don't actually think anybody else really believes this after the war. But Harris sticks to his guns. And so it's, to some extent, if he becomes a marginal or a very unsympathetic figure, it's slightly his own fault. But I also think that one of the problems is that with discussing area bombing is that it has become this very kind of polarized thing where you either take the extremely maximalist kind of Harris view that in and of itself it was capable of being able to end the war without any kind of ground campaign in Europe, or on the other hand that it was complete waste of time, that it was misdirection of effort, that it was just this sort of brutal, incompetent war. And my own views
than that, isn't it? Yeah, it's much more nuanced than that, I think. Yeah.
Well, my own view is increasingly coming towards a kind of, I guess it's a sort of center ground position where Harris was always expecting more of it than it was capable of. But on the other hand, I think you have to understand area bombing in coordination with campaigns against specific targets like oil and transportation in 1944, and both complement and the other. If you had not been doing area bombing at the same time as oil and transport, it would not have been as effective, and vice versa. But it's a tough one because an awful lot of it depends upon hypotheticals. It depends upon doing a certain amount of counterfactual analysis. And reasonable people can come to reasonably different conclusions.
I think my own views change all the time, literally from week to week. Yeah, it just changes.
Yeah, I mean, I've changed my views. Yeah. I've changed my views in the course of writing these two books. I've gone back and forth on it. As I say, my own view now is probably a little bit more favourable to area bombing than it had been at the beginning. Although I'm very ambivalent about the ethical questions
which is a whole other episode.
That's a whole other.
That's a whole episode. That is, yeah. I mean, I'm just wondering that when we talk about Harris, the fact that he's the longest-serving commander of Bomber Command, he takes command over a period that we generally remember. We mentioned the Dam Busters,
which he hated,
turning
of course.
But also after that, he is interviewed for the World at War. He is in the Dam Busters film. There is this TV mini film, Bomber Harris, at the end of the 1980s. Does that contribute? And the statue, of course, that is revealed in 1992, I think. Does that also contribute to this longevity of Harris as the face of RAF Bomber Command?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, of course, he becomes very identified with Dresden, doesn't he? In a way which is rather odd, really, because Harris didn't decide to bomb Dresden. Was actually not very enthusiastic about bombing Dresden. Also didn't think that Dresden was a particularly unusual raid and was merely a kind of logical, consequence of decisions that had been made, far earlier. But because, I mean, if he really ought to be remembered for anything, it's Hamburg, which he did decide very much to attack. And of course, the death toll was significantly higher as well. I mean, the fact that he lives so long, I mean, he lives until his early 90s, probably, and he is quite visible. And still, as you say, in shows like The World at War, he's still a very uncompromising defender of the policy. So I think he also, though, becomes something of a figure on the right as well, because once you get into the sort of memory wars in the 1980s about the bombing war, amongst other things, that he is seen as being, to use an anachronistic term, the kind of the unwoke spokesperson. There is also the sense, I mean, this is a whole other rabbit hole, but there is the sense, which I think is quite misunderstood, that Harris had, complained about the lack of recognition for his air crews in 1945, which I think actually is a complete misunderstanding of what the controversy was in 1945. But there is the sense in which he sort of comes to represent the bomber crews who are being marginalized and disparaged by, sort of left-leaning, bleeding hearts in the Thatcher years. So he's a very convenient figure, I think, for both sides. And he's also, I mean, he's a bit of an odd fella, really, in lots of ways. I think one of the things that strikes me about, I mean, although he's from Cheltenham, but there's something slightly un-English about Harris. I mean, of course, he spent some time in Rhodesia before World War One, and he always considers himself thereafter to be a sort of he identifies as Rhodesian, I think, more than he does English. And I've sometimes wondered whether that sort of colonial adjacent identity that he has something to do with his unwillingness to be very English in his euphemisms about the bombing war, and to have a certain amount of kind of impatience with somebody like Portal, who will never use 5 words where he can use 50 in order to sort of talk around some of the more unpleasant aspects of the war. And I think there is something slightly English about that, which I think Harris never likes. And as I say, he sort of takes on this slightly blunt-talking colonial kind of identity.
I've got to ask you, if we've got time. Obviously, you love Britain at Bay, and I mentioned it to a number of students. One of a group that I'm teaching are talking about the Britain alone myth, an idea. I mentioned Britain at Bay, and I mentioned the whole aspect of the Shire folk. And as soon as I mentioned that, a bunch of Lord of the Rings fans just went, "Oh my goodness, I want to pay attention to this." But I have to ask, being a little bit of having a little bit of a soft spot for early bombers, you mentioned the ferry battle, right. And it's often considered absolutely, totally obsolete at the start of the war. But I was very, very interested with what you had to say about the fact that there were possibilities that it could have been an effective light bomber. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. I mean, I found the battle story fascinating because I had grown up with this, these kind of images of the Valley of the Shadow of Death and on the Meuse in May 1940, and so these obsolete aircraft being plunged into death, and it's a horrible experience, the ghastly experience that actually happens. But I think it's quite interesting, this whole question about what does it mean to say an aircraft is obsolete. The Stuka, arguably the Ju-87, is even more obsolete in May 1940.
Rubbish.
The Fairey Battle. It's older, it's slower, it's more lightly armored. What matters isn't the inherent characteristics of the aircraft. What matters is the operational circumstances in which it flies, and also the kind of doctrine which is applied to it. I think the thing about the battle is that it was a misconceived aircraft, in the sense that it was, the idea of a light bomber, single engine bomber that was going to bomb the Ruhr, was a kind of product of 1930s thinking. And by the time you get to 1939, it's clearly not going to be able to do that. But you've still got an awful lot of Fairey battles. And the Fairey company, in fact, is going to continue producing them because it's not ready to shift gears yet and to start, producing anything else. Now, there are one or two folks in the RAF who argue at the beginning of the war that if you can't use the Fairey battle to be an effective strategic bomber, what you might be able to do is to convert it into a decent close air support aircraft, which the Army very badly needs. In fact, is crying out for it. You probably, if you got to start from first principles, you probably wouldn't build the Fairey battle as a close air support aircraft. It's still a bit slow, but you work. In war, you work with what you've got, and if you had, there are various modifications you could have made to it, where you perhaps would not exactly have had a Sturmovik, but you would have had something that could have filled that role to a certain extent. But you would have to not only drastically reconceive the battle's mission, you'd also have to drastically adopt a policy of air superiority, which the RAF is not particularly interested in 1940. The reason why the Stuka proves to be so effective in France in 1940 is because it is flying in a context in which it's unopposed by enemy single-engine fighters, because the Germans have an air umbrella over it, which means that it can fly around and do as it pleases. Had the battle enjoyed the same air superiority, and there's nothing in principle to say that it couldn't have done, it would have been a very different story. So I think that, the point about the battle is I think it tells you something about trying to. There's a certain kind of over-determinism about technology when we think about war. What matters far more than exactly what the battle's cruising speed was, or exactly what its armament was. What matters a great deal more is how did the RAF imagine using aircraft like this, and it makes a series of really bad choices in 1939.
I mean that's the whole sort of looking at tech and going down the whole top trumps side of things. How fast is something? What's its height and everything? And it's obviously more complex than that. It goes further than that.
Well, there's a very interesting comparison that you can make with the Vickers Wellington. The Vickers Wellington is designed as a day bomber, and it completely fails in that role in 1939. And you could argue then that the Wellington is just as much a failure, if the battle is a failure, than so is the Wellington. The difference is that the RAF believes in strategic bombing in a way that it doesn't believe in close air support, for instance, and it's willing to reconsider how to use the Wellington and to convert it into a fairly effective night bomber. And so we have a totally different view as a result of its use in 1941 and 1942.
The Wellington gets used for quite a few years, doesn't it? It ends up.
It has an awful lot of uses,
if you like.
Absolutely. Does the battle, because it turns out the battle's a very, very easy plane to fly. It makes a very good training aircraft. It can be used for pulling drones and for targeting and things like that. it's got nothing to do with, say, the inherent characteristics of the aircraft. It's about what you decide to do
and how you use
the circumstances in which you allow it to operate. You know, so the Stuka proves to be. I mean, if anything, the success of the Stuka in 1940, I think, is a disaster for the Luftwaffe because they stick with it far too long. You know, they're continuing to use it in 1943 and 1944. By which time it's if it was obsolete in 1940, it's totally obsolete by then. You know, but they're not forced to come up with more imaginative approaches to that particular kind of role.
Absolutely, completely agree. He should write a book, shouldn't he, Jane?
He should, yeah. More books.
Done that. I'm never writing about 1940 again if I can possibly help it. I've done it. It's like I'll leave it to other people for this now.
Oh, that was absolutely brilliant, Al. Thank you so much. I think that's given people a lot of food for thought, particularly what they may have previously thought about Harris, and perhaps challenge some of the conventional wisdom, if you like. I think that's well overdue. I think someone, and I'm looking at you, Alan, should write another book about Harris. I think it's time for a reappraisal of Harris. Yeah. I nominate you for that task.
We'll see. I'm kind of once I've gotten the next book out of the way, I'm kind of open to take a break. I've been writing books for 20 years. Frankly, I think I've run out of ideas, but we will see. My head is full of things like Market Garden right now, and Burma in 1945 and what have you. So I'll have to rethink that someday.
Right, well, that's been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Alan, and for giving us your valuable time. Thank you so much for listening, everybody, and we'll be back again in a couple of weeks talking about who knows what. Thanks very much. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Bye.